I'm going to do an introduction for our guest speaker. So let me do that now, and then gives chance for more people to show up. I'm honored to introduce to you my teacher and friend, Francisco Guevara. He's a Mexican artist, visual artist. His most recent show, Omens of Empire, questions the meaning of the resplendent materials stolen by European empires, precious stones, radiant bird feathers, and exquisite minerals. He is a curator who specializes in Emmanuel Levinas's ethics as applied to the design of transcultural artistic projects and the analysis of performativity in contemporary art practices. His experience spans more than 20 years of designing, curating, and managing art projects through visual arts education and historiography of art, facilitating development, sustainability, and social transformation. As a visual artist, Guevara investigates the historical construction of difference as a process, as differentiation, and its relationship with the performativity of identity, including gender, class, and race. I met Francisco, or Paco as I know him, through a mutual mentor and best friend, Dr. Kirsten Pai Buick, who is a full professor in art and art history and the department chair of Africana Studies here at UNM. I'm sure that Francisco would encourage you as much as I would to take her classes. Her teachings are indispensable for surviving the world we find ourselves in. And I also want to thank Nayeli, who's here, and the educator of Architopia, whose name I've already forgotten. I'm so sorry. And thank you so much for making this possible and being here with us all. So without further delay, please help me welcome Francisco to our class.
Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. It's a pleasure. It's an honor. It's a wonderful presentation. What you introduction, what you gave, and I think the key part is what you mentioned in the end, the process of surviving this horrible, nasty world, which at the same time it's a song worth singing, like RuPaul would actually says. So the presentation is geared towards many of these ideas of surviving and movement and rhythm. And I'm so excited to be here today. It's a presentation that I wanted to give, since a long time, because Mexico is such an important uh, space for Audre Lorde's work. And I took into consideration several of the questions that Dr. Eva Hayward suggested, which I find really, really important. And before we begin, it's a dialogue, it's open. At any point, any questions are welcome. I am not very good with technology because, of course, I am old and getting old, which is also an invention, but I feel very real. So at any point, Nayeli is going to be helping, and also Eva, if you can help us, if there's any questions that need to be asked, feel free, because sometimes I can't see them. And I'm going to formally introduce my colleagues. To my right is Nayeli Hernandez. She's our programs director for all of our residency sites and programs here at Architopia. I'll also be giving a short introduction of what is Architopia. And also to my left is Xochitl Hernandez. She's our academic coordinator, and she oversees all the contents and follow up on the readings and the process that happens at Architopia academically. And before we begin with the actual presentation, I'm going to share my screen with you. Let me know if you're able to see it in just a moment. Let's see. It's here. There we go. Okay, perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. So before we begin, we always think about our land acknowledgement, which is important for the work that we do in general at Architopia, but also personally, and all of the histories of our staff and experiences that intersect with what we do. So I'm going to begin with that. You also have on the first slide my email. If there's any questions or anything and you want to reach out, I'm always here. I always honor anyone who decides to teach because it is a very complex and complicated, but very, very generous process. So in that sense, I'm always helping in any possible way. So Architopia acknowledges that all of our artist residencies are located on historical lands that over the centuries have been continuously defended from the invasion of multiple empires, including the Hispanic monarchy, the First French Empire, the British Empire, and the Mexican-American War. We recognize that our work is only possible because of the multiple histories of resistance and contestation that intersect in Mexico, Peru, and Italy. Um,
Thank you.
oh, yes, I lost my track. Including each and every one of you. Through our mission, we continuously acknowledge the voices of those who have been historically unheard, seeking to address the violence and injustices of settler colonialism and imperialism, knowing that envisioning justice is only possible in the anti-colonial way. This acknowledgement is not metaphorical, but rather an active engagement in which all of our artists in residence are included. It is the first step to honor the land, the wisdom, to love and respect the people that inhabit Mexico, Peru, and Italy. And one of the important aspects that we're going to be thinking about is Mexico, but not as a country, after all, and I'm also going to mention that in the presentation. Nationalism invented countries where they didn't exist. So we're rather going to think about it as a space, like the space that we're actually creating here all together in this session. So I want to begin with these two quotes. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. My silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, I had made contact with other women while we examined the words to fit a world in which we all believe, bridging our differences. And this is from Audre Lorde, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. So before we think about Audre Lorde, I want to introduce really briefly two ideas. One of them is Architopia, and the other one is going to be Oaxaca. And this is the actual space where we are located right now, our headquarters in Puebla. Puebla is a city very near Mexico City, which is the capital of Mexico. And Architopia is an internationally established nonprofit arts and cultural foundation with a social scope that emphasizes critical thinking through artistic practices. Our customized professional international artists in residence programs are one of the largest and most reputable in the world. Our residency sites are located in 4 distinct cultural regions selected for the historical importance, influence, and artistic contribution to the world. Char Puebla and Oaxaca in Mexico, Cusco in Peru, and the southern part of Italy. Considering how dominant visual culture has contributed to the invention of Mexico, Peru, and Italy in popular imagination, at Architopia, we are constantly exploring local epistemologies and cultures of resistance as a source of knowledge to contribute to social change. We are invested in approaching creative practices with critical perspectives to challenge all preconceived notions of history, in quotes, and place, also in quotes, and through the use of dynamic language, we question the idea of the body as a fixed identity. And through the years, we have successfully created a generous space where different perspectives meet and address important questions on the legacy of art history and the current state of the world. Our methodology is unique and inspired by the works of Immanuel Levinas, Knut Lodstrup, and Audre Lorde in the field of ethics, and we continuously challenge the narratives of artistic mobility and cultural exchanges, rather than approaching international encounters as opportunities in time and space to provoke change in the world. And that's what is the most important aspect, how we think about change. And what we see here are three images of Oaxaca. The first one is of Mitla. And I want you to start thinking about how landscape is overlapping with these layers of extermination. On the bottom, you can barely see the remainings of the important site. Mitla is the notion of Mictlan, which is the space where our ancestors live and where they go to. So it's a sacred site. And on top, it was built a Christian Catholic church with also the stones from the actual site. And all of these ideas are going to be important to understand Audre Lorde's work, because our story with her brings Oaxaca to the forefront. And on the right, we also have two images, one of our studio, where you can see some of the equipment that we use for extracting color and weaving. Our programs in Oaxaca focus specifically on writers and also fibers, and they're rooted in local knowledge and context. And at the bottom is the facade of the front part of the house where we can host, where we have our residence. And for more than a decade, I have been working on the problem of art and its entanglement with violence as an open-ended question, specifically in relation to the visual arts, art history, and the art world. Art is imagined as a trigger of possible change, the medium through which intentions can be preserved and make everything better. Art is indeed very powerful, but its consequences are not necessarily positive, as it most frequently celebrates and contributes to the appropriation of labor, the extinction of the environment, the displacement of people, the occupation of land, and also, in the end, the extermination of many people. Art materializes the ideological inventions of history and place, and it has the power to make us embody without our consent. After all, it is the perception of our body what limits our experience, not only how we experience, but what we experience. Nevertheless, how we embody is not who we are. At Architopia, and as part of my practice as a scholar, I have encountered and mentored more than 1,000 artists, which means I'm old, historians and writers for approximately 110 different countries around the globe. Through Architopia International Artist Residency programs, I have contributed to develop a critical methodology focusing on ethical responsibility and rethinking time and space as a tactic to decenter creative practices, which opens up the possibility for artists and writers to emancipate themselves from place and history. And this is important because we have to think of we collectively, and that's where Kirsten Buick, which is on our board, and also Eva Hayworth is on our board. They both contribute to this notion of dialogue across time and space. And we have put together an advisory board that allows us to continuously update critical perspectives and critiques and ways of moving, so that artists, and rather than artists, everyone we encounter in the residency can move in different ways to survive, to resist, to contest, to provoke change. And all of our residents, as a result of these, are confronted with questions of space and time as dimensions with responsibility versus history and place as realities rooted in subjectivity. Artists and writers are introduced to the use of dynamic language, which we will be doing today, to understand how meaning takes place, literally how space is distorted into place, learning to challenge ideology while also being exposed to a very careful process of negotiation of historical relationships through artistic techniques and local epistemologies. Today, we're going to explore a little bit of that, of how Audre Lorde is also rooted some of her thoughts in these local epistemologies in some ways. And this methodology is a result of many experiences, a response to persistent ideas about Mexico, Peru, or Italy, patterns in attitudes, and recurrent themes within projects and creative practices. And here I want to introduce Audre Lorde, and this is in 1968. It's a picture that was taken by her partner, and we need to understand her practice as a time-based practice. And we're going to think about rhythm. We're going to think about these tension that she creates with words to allow space to be opened up for us to appear. And this presentation is put together by several questions that Dr. Hayworth sent me that I found really, really useful. And she asked me, how was Audre Lorde's in her work shape and inform our teaching and practices at the artist residency? What are some of the challenges that we have experienced in teaching artists and residents in general to think and work with Audre Lorde's work? How did we learn? How did we stumble upon her work? And this is through Kirsten, and I'll show you some of the ideas that also intersect with her work. And what are the challenges that we find in the process of Audre Lorde, but also what do we still learn from her, which is what I'm going to show you as well. And how Audre Lorde has shaped my own artistic practice. I didn't include images of my work in this session, but I promise we can have as many sessions that you need or want, and I'll be able to share some of my work as well as other residents, and how this conceptual practice that intersects, of course, with Architopia, it is rooted in her. So I want to bring back the notion of Oaxaca as a space that continuously has informed what we have done at Architopia, and also to think about Mexico as a space beyond borders rather than the southern part of the North America continent, so that we can expand it. And one of the first ideas I encountered when thinking about Audre Lorde is she studied in Mexico. She came to Mexico in very interesting circumstances. And at the same time, in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century rather than late, Benito Juarez, which is a very important thinker that allows to frame the notion of freedom in Mexico, which is a little bit different from the United States, had to spend some time right after the American invasion of 1846 to 1848 to Mexico. And that is key to understand how this dialogue of resistance has been across borders and beyond borders in ways that we have learned to move. And the importance, I'm going to describe it. And like I said, as Benedict Anderson writes, nationalism invented countries where they didn't actually exist. So we're expanding this notion. And Benito Juarez was a prominent Mexican lawyer and politician from Oaxaca who made history as the first indigenous president of the Americas, which indigenous we also have to question because it's a term that is coined in the 20th century, particularly in the context of Mexico. But it's also important to understand where he's coming from in terms of his ideas of resistance and freedom and movement, etc. And he rose from a lower class background, which is also connected to this notion of indigenous, which profoundly influenced his commitment to social justice and equity. Juarez spent time in New Orleans from 1853 to 1855, where he encountered ideas of freedom while working alongside African American communities. This experience helped shape his political philosophy and crafted his notions of justice and liberty. Upon his return to Mexico, he was instrumental in drafting and promulgating the Mexican Constitution of 1857, which is very important to everything that we still have today as the rights that we still have to negotiate, which enshrined civil rights and banned slavery for all Mexicans and anyone entering Mexican territory, emphasizing the importance of freedom and the protection of the law. And you have to think about in the context of the United States, he is already extending a space in which anyone, by mere fact of crossing the border, would become free again. And he successfully resisted the French invasion, which was one of the fewest examples of how communities have resisted empires and actually ended up in the execution of Maximilian, because he wanted to toy around with empires here in Mexico, and it was not possible because of Juarez. So he established a legacy of resistance in Mexico that continues to resonate with the work that we do at Arquitopia. Beyond the political aspects of his work, it's the notion of freedom and extending this space as a possibility for others. And whether Juarez's leadership and efforts laid the foundation for questioning historical exploitation and social injustices. And I want to introduce two ideas that do resonate with the notions of indigenous and indigeneity that we're going to question as a notion of framing the body, which is racism. And this is also from Audre Lorde, the belief in the inherent superiority of one race over all others, and thereby the right to dominance, manifest and implied. And with this, I'm extending it to classism, which is more than racism prevalent in Mexico. The feeling, which is very important, it's a 19th century technology produced by the belief of our inherent superiority over all races, geographies, species, and all beings, and thereby becoming the right to project our hate and ignorance over any form of life, prioritizing a moral and capital gain. And this is my definition of classism, meaning how this notion of classism centers property. And this is why we incorporated the voice of Donna Haraway, races, geography, species, and thereby becoming this right to project our hate, because it's not really that we are fearing, it's not homophobia, it's just hate. Phobia, I mean, it's not fear, it's always hate. And of course, it's rooted in ignorance. And then we begin investigating what it means to be in place through the body. And Michel de Certeau distinguishes place, in quotes, the map order representation from space, also in quotes, so that we can negotiate it, the illegible, heterogeneous, contextually Protean use of time and location. And with these, I acknowledge there's many debates and conversations and dialogues about place and space, and sometimes even a third. I'm not claiming to have the right definition, but I find the Certeau's ideas useful. So space, we define it as a relationship, and place, we're going to see how it functions. So in that sense, space lives and place is dead. Space is actualized and place is described. Thus, time that has been made public through measuring cannot constitute space, even if we date it according to spatial measurements relations, and that means the body. What makes it ontologically relevant is the specific kind of making present, in this sense, the body, which makes measurement possible according to Heidegger. And what we do here, what we are unraveling and disclosing, is how we use the body, weaponizing to imagine we can actually measure time, but we can't. And the outcome of that measuring is always labor, leisure, and exploitation. It comes in threes, cannot be separated, and that's redistributed in other experiences. In other words, as Simone de Beauvoir asserted, the body is a historical situation and is a manner of doing, dramatizing, and reproducing historical situations. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So Mexico has been the subject of imperial fantasies since Hernán Cortés effected the Spanish so-called conquest in the early 16th century. Cortés' rhetorical domestication of the landscape redirected Spanish aspirations from commerce to colonization and transformed the strange new world, in quotes, into New Spain, a rational extension of this old world, also in quotes. And with this, we have to think about what Oriana Baddeley writes when she says, the visual culture of Mexico has been laden with the weight of representational meaning since the first contact of Europe and the Americas in the 15th century. The flora and fauna of Mexico has been explained and described, its inhabitants recognizably characterized for both internal and external audiences. And this has to do with the horrific work that Teresa Margolles does as an artist, where she thinks about death in relation to Mexico, in terms of our national narrative, etc. So these descriptions and the power of literature is what has constructed this notion. And I present this image of news from Mexico. And what is happening here is when the Mexican-American invasion started in 1846, William Prescott wrote the book, The History of the Conquest of Mexico. And as soldiers moved during the Mexican-American War, as we know it, they also thought of themselves as travelers. And the travel literature they produced was extensive and was frequently published, like we see in this painting. Very often, soldiers would treat matters that were grave and serious in an inappropriately light-hearted manner. So they would talk about rape, but they would talk about extraction and exploitation and killing. And Prescott's book helped restage the images of the siege of Tenochtitlan, representing the future victory in a place fixed in the past. As soldiers sieged the castle of Chapultepec, which is a very important sacred site in Mexico, they fantasized of finally reaching the halls of Montezuma, a phrase that would later be included in the Marine Corps hymn. And Prescott's legacy had been ingrained in the invention of Mexico for that matter. For example, Richard W. Wilkie, an American veteran and student during the mid-50s, at the aforementioned Mexico City, at the Mexico City College, remember his time in Mexico, and this is his quote. While reading Prescott's book on the conquest of Mexico, I envisioned how Cortés and his men fought their way out of Tenochtitlan, the island Aztec capital on what is now called Lake Texcoco, along the southern causeway very close to where I sat reading. I also read books on the US invasion of Mexico under General Scott in 1848, only a century before, and how his men fought up the Reforma, which is the avenue, the main avenue in Mexico City, to capture Chapultepec Castle from the Niños Héroes, the children soldiers, which is also a national myth. I remember how extraordinary it felt to be reading at the precise place where history had been made in the 16th and 19th century. And imagine how this horrific idea of reading and reimagining the possibility of invading Mexico. So Mexico as a fantasy place was fixed in the past, where bodies are even imagined as landscape and ready to be
So
discovered.
we can't hear you.
Oh,
Sorry.
can you hear me okay now? Is the
You're
audio
coming
back?
in and out.
Let me just check.
I'm able to hear okay.
Is the audio back? Working properly?
And
Let me see.
oh, I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Yes. So as I was reading, for instance, as Wilkie continues to reflect on the experience of living and studying in Mexico, he wrote, opening of quote, "We were among a group of students who came to explore new worlds, to discover new ways of seeing and thinking, to help open new roads to remote places, to climb snow cape volcanoes and explore all of southern Mexico. to feel the historical and artistic heartbeat of Mexico, and to do it with companions who thrive in the extraordinary milieu that existed there at the time. Having the chance to live and study in Mexico City was an adventure enough, but when the natural and human landscapes of southern and central Mexico became part of the experimental classroom, the education that each of us received went far beyond anything most of us had anticipated. So think about how he's framing Mexico as a new discover on his own, and rather than the 4 centuries and 5 centuries that have already passed. And I use these to contrast Audre Lorde's experience in Mexico, because we could actually frame it in such ways. And here I introduce the FBI file on Audre Lorde, which is really wonderful. I recently found it, and it's explaining her relationship with Mexico. So the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened case file on Audre Lorde in 1954, which includes a brief and mostly involves Lorde's being questioned on several occasions regarding her and her friends' ties to the Communist Party. The investigation started in June of 1954 while she was in Oaxaca. They followed her all the way to Oaxaca when Lorde was a 20-year-old college student living and studying in Mexico. Agents questioned her why she was in Mexico and what her ties were to the Communist Party and who her friends were. While her rationale for doing so was not discussed in the FBI case file, Lorde had left the United States for Mexico for various reasons. She had been active in the progressive politics scene in New York and was a member of the Committee in Defense of the Rosenbergs. When Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted for espionage and were executed by the federal government in 1953, Lorde became concerned about the political climate in the United States, which is very familiar today. At the same time, she personally felt belittled and dismissed by several African American writers who were members of the Harlem Writers Guild. Many had expressed to her that she was spending too much time with white women and were critical of her lesbian lifestyle. Moreover, and this is all in quotes, her friends who were aligned with progressive politics also became increasingly small-minded regarding her lesbianism. It was around this time Lorde had heard from her friend Al Sandler about the American exile community of writers and artists that were living in Mexico, which is actually the same time that of the quote that I just read. As Zami relates, her writing in the early 1950s, a sense of hopelessness and despair pushed her to leave the communist-obsessed United States. Shortly after attending the funerals of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, around whose case she had intensively organized, she arrived in Mexico City. She had just been fired from her dangerously toxic factory job, a job that may well have contributed to her premature death, where she had lied about productivity outputs in order to earn enough money to travel. It is significant that Lorde's entry into Mexico was framed by U.S. capitalist racism and imperialism, and particularly well as ascetic sexual mores, a colonial separation of mind and body. This is very important because we're going to see how she reclaims that possibility, rejecting the notion of the body. No longer able to stomach the McCarthyism purges, Lorde took the government's murder of the Rosenbergs as a final confirmation that she could no longer survive the hostile surroundings of the United States. And here we see an early photo of Audre Lorde a few years after she returned to the United States after the Mexico experience. Lorde's arrival in Mexico City was filled with wonders. Intrigued by its sights, smells, and sounds, she corrected her habits of looking down at her feet while walking. Now she wanted to take in everything around her, um, emboldened by the sea of the non-white faces. And this is something that also Kristen mentioned, that for us it's a given, but it's really interesting to think about it in that sense. She felt able to walk with her head held high, which she described as a form of, in quotes, proud exhilaration unlike any other experience she had ever known. And these are her quotes. For me, walking hurry back to my own little house in this land of color and dark people who said Negro and meant something beautiful, who noticed me as I moved among them, this decision felt like a promise of some kind that I have believed in spite of myself, a possible validation. Another quote, it was here in the breathtaking dawns and quick-heeled twilight of Cuernavaca that I learned that it is really easier to be quiet in the woods. One morning I came down a hill into the square at dawn to catch my bus ride to the district. The birds suddenly cut loose all around me in the unbelievable, sweet, warm air. I had never heard anything so beautiful and unexpected before. I felt shaken by the waves of song. For the first time in my life, I had an insight into what poetry could be. This is very, very important because it's beginning to signal a different kind of rhythm. I could use words to recreate that feeling rather than create a dream, which is what so much of my writing had been before. By temporarily leaving the United States, her experience became the groundwork for an anti-racist, queer, feminist praxis that link anti-capitalist and anti-racist movements with new forms of embodied sexuality, sentience, and emotion. So I want to start us to think about a different way of being. And we continue with a quote by Lord, I was happier that I'd been in what seemed like a very long time. What was even better, I was wholly conscious that I was. And Lord's presence in Mexico triggered deep physical and psychic familiarity, allowing her to reach modes of self-definition that had eluded US hegemonic forms. In her descriptions of Mexico, we witnessed Lord as she first began imagining the radical possibility of a shifting racial landscape outside the deepening forms of violent US taxonomies of racial and sexual difference. Mexico symbolized a different way of being, a space from which she might attain some breathing or living room, in quotes, away from the hegemonizing forces of the races, her sexist, xenophobic, and capitalist violence she had experienced in New York. Her language began to reflect epistemologies, modes of being, and affective states that were not yet accessible, and that previously had been disciplined and shaped by the overdetermined experience of selfhood by US ideology. By fully experiencing herself, she had gained access to a larger cosmology and was no longer tied to the abstracted Cartesian individual premise on the colonial division of body and mind. And this is very important to think about, that Cartesian division of body and mind. The Epiphany laid the foundation for her revolutionary thinking about the necessity of poetry as a vehicle for holistic and social change. Opening, of course, I learned that day on the mountain, she later told Rich, that words can match that feeling and recreate it. And this is from Tamara Lia Spira, The Geopolitics of the Erotic, Audre Lorde's Mexico, and the Decolonization of the Revolutionary Imagination, which is an essay I used to prepare this presentation, and I'll be happy to also share with you if you're interested. And with these, I want to begin getting into the thought of Audre Lorde. We're going to connect it with the master tools. And this has to do with the notion of tactic versus strategy. Michel de Certeau draws a distinction between strategies, the grids of power structuring our worlds, and tactics, the inventive practices of peoples in everyday life. Strategies are the seemingly totalizing plans of power, power structures, and large institutions, while tactics are the everyday practices of those who appear to be dominated by strategies that creatively turn structures of power to their advantage. And this is also to begin thinking that we are all colonized subjects. And from there, we proceed. And this is why Audre Lorde's work is time-based. Certeau presents quotidian tactics as signs of living realities that pulse within and against systems of strategies that can never quite contain them. A tactic is a calculus which cannot count on a proper spatial institutional localization, nor thus on a borderline, distinguishing the other as a visible totality. So strategies is how we gain access, how we navigate, how we move based on privilege, which is actually the perception of our bodies. And tactics are time-based, seizing the opportunity, taking the chance. But it's also not only meaning that tactics will not gain terrain and take over, but tactics allow things to emerge differently. In other words, we know something needs to happen, but we don't know exactly what or when. While a strategy assumes privileges and depends upon a circumscribed place, a tactic is characterized by the absence of such a locus. Instead, it must play within an imposed terrain, manipulating and diverting the spaces already created by the strategy. Because it has no place, tactics depend on time. And we're connecting here with rhythm, with poetry. Always seeking opportunities that must be seized on the wing, manipulating events that turn them into opportunities. Strategies establish the power in places, tactics intervene in that power through a clever use of time and opportunity. Tactics are momentary victories of time over place. And this is how we need to start thinking about our notion of infinitude, eternity, which can only manifest, we make it manifest through moving, not the body. It's by moving. So in the master tools, we see two very important tactics, not strategies, but rather tactics. So first, we begin with interdependency is a way to become free, which allows the I to be. And think about how it's not rooted in the Cartesian notion of mind, body, but rather to be. Not in order to be used, but in order to be created. This is a difference between the passive be and the active being. And this is what she's beginning to signal here, challenging the I, the notion of place, and even the notion of freedom. So difference must be not merely tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic. Community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. So she's leading us to the notion of difference at the core of community, because she always says nobody's free until everyone is free, which is not the same as freedom. So she's gearing towards this notion of emancipation. And here's the key to the whole structure. This is the first tactic that we notice. Within the interdependence of mutual, non-dominant, in parentheses, differences, lies that security which enables us to descend into the chaos of knowledge and return with true visions of our future, along with the concomitant power to effect those changes which can bring the future into being. Now, here is a key to the whole structure of the essay. She's putting non-dominant in parentheses, which is making us stop right there. She could have easily write non-dominant differences so that we just pass through it. And that means we need to examine differences. And she's thinking differences in a larger sense. Differences are not those that are visible. Because think about how she's emphasizing non-dominant. So in that sense, we need to begin by thinking, what are dominant differences? And dominant differences are those who establish a relationship of dominance. Whether we are being dominated or dominating, because it's also time-based, it doesn't matter. It's still a dominant relationship. And that means that is race, class, gender, sex, ethnicity, age, economic status, everything that we think is visible. So if all of these are dominant differences, what will be non-dominant differences? And I can stop and ask you the question, or we can also continue and we will eventually answer the question, but I'm going to respond. She's actually pushing it further to the limits of the possibility because she's challenging body. Non-dominant differences means that we are actually very, very, very different to each other, to the point that we don't understand each other. That doesn't mean we can't work together. That doesn't mean we share struggles in different ways, in different directions, but that means we can feel, learn, experience in the same way others do. And that means that we are very different from our parents. We couldn't be more different from our parents. And we share DNA and we share social ways of understanding body and culture and eating. So if we are so different to our parents and our siblings and our cousins, etc., imagine how different we are to everyone else. And that means the only possibility to understand non-dominant differences is with two concepts. The first one is to know that we are always alone in this world. Absolutely alone. And think about this moment in which we are sharing this space, this time, yet we cannot know what we are thinking. Each one of us cannot predict what I am thinking, or what Eva's thinking, or what Nayeli is thinking, or Xochitl, or any one of you. Each one of you, it's alone in your own thoughts. Not only that, we are dying because the clock is ticking, and because of the perception of time as being productive, as what the United States and the British Empire and many other empires crafted in the process of history, it has to be money. Time is money. And I always say time is not money in Mexico. I don't know what it is, but I can assure it's not money. And that means the clock is ticking and we know we are dying. So we try to reach out to one another. What do we do about this? How do we change this horrific world? And we're always met by friction. And friction is something empire doesn't want, doesn't like. By the way, empire is something I learned from Kirsten Buick, is the notion of evil that we can eventually ground in very specific ways of understanding. It could be nationalism, it could be capitalism, it could be racism, any ism. So, but we use empire as the abstraction so that we can refer to it. An empire doesn't like friction because it wants this process to be minimized and not to be to actually be controlled. So race, class, gender is invented in the process of friction to minimize the process of seeing and to actually predict what the encounter will be. And in that sense, Audre Lorde says we need to embrace friction. Friction is not only necessary, it's the impossibility, can't stop it. And friction creates heat, heat creates sparks, sparks burn. Audre Lorde associates this burning, this friction, to non-dominant forms of knowledge. I'll continue exploring that in the next slides. So we then look at the second tactic. For the master tools will never dismantle the master's house. And this is referring to this notion of when we begin questioning dominant knowledge, suddenly nothing makes sense and we have to let go of the I think, therefore I am, separation of the mind and the body. And in that sense, we start spinning. And she says, we will eventually emerge with a true vision of change. And however, to understand change, we need to think about how change cannot be predicted because the master tools will never dismantle the master's house. And that means change cannot be predicted. And that means we have, the only answer to any question about change is always disruption, interruption, distortion. I will show you in the process, and I know I'm taking a little bit longer. I can see the clock ticking, but if we can't finish the session, we can actually continue later if that's okay. Because if we don't go into these deep concepts, I'd rather stop and be able to address them rather than rushing and then leaving questions. So no problem if we need to have another session. If the space allows it and ever wants it, I'll be more than happy to do so. For the master tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this is what it means. Change can only happen if we don't predict it. Change is the unexpected, and the only possibility if we want to trigger change is to interrupt empire, to disrupt it. And that means do not predict change. Change is going to be painful, as we know. So why body? Why academia? The body has become a central concern both in academia and the wider culture, providing one of the few points of direct contact between these often divorced spheres. After the scandal over Robert Mapplethorpe's 1988 exhibition, the rise of new techniques of medical imagining of the body, and the dissolution of many of the norms of the sexualized identity, the body question continues to gain urgency. Indeed, at all times of social uncertainty, the representation of the body is a key concern. And this is why after COVID, we see all these concerns again with the body and how it needs to be made legible. The current moment is an amplification of the experience Walter Benjamin perceived in the generation who lived through the First World War. In quotes, a generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds. And beneath those clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. And even, this is from Nicholas Mirsov's Body's case, but he even mentions and continues, now we have even changed the sky. So imagine how profound this process has been. And I want us to understand body in this context. And in the image, we have America by Theodore de Gall after Johannes Stradamus from Nova Reperta in the 1600s. We see Americo Vespucci, of course, dressed in full regalia with technology, movement, controlling time. Well, on the right, we have America open for rape, naked, which is our shared histories. On the back, we also see the smoke of a roasted leg of a human being that is being eaten by cannibals because we in the imagination of colonizers are always these naked, sexy cannibals. So the body is mutable, incomplete, and always in flux. This alarming feeling of instability has led to numerous efforts to control the development of the physical body by promoting certain physical characteristics at the expense of others. In standard settler colonial legal phrasing, in quotes, adverse possession means taking land without the consent of those who were already there, and thereby acquiring a title to that land legally. It remains an active and central part of US law and also other parts of the world, and such taking possession without consent is equally applicable to bodily violations of all kinds. Since the 16th century, Europeans have visualized colonialism as rape, and this has to be understood in the context of the body. So what is the body? Your body is not itself, it is a battleground. It is subject to control through the legacy of the Renaissance, colonialism, imperialism. The, in quotes, perfect body is now under siege by the pharmaceutical, aerobic, dietetic, liposuctive, calorie-controlled cybernetic world of empire. It is a verb rather than a noun. It is a process rather than a thing. And this is, I'm connecting it to how landscape is imagined as a body. It is a symbol rather than, it is a symbol, a resource, and a medium, a system of delivery, communication, and a communicating event. It doesn't merely signify or symbolize power relations. Body is at once the final point of resistance to the global imperatives of empire and the first to be affected by it. So we have to think about body as a point of resistance, as a point that allows us to move. Rather than imagining that empire doesn't allow any possibility of change, which is overwhelming, and we frequently, we get informed by the news that it should be the way it should be. In fact, we don't have a body. The body is movement. I never use body. I use movement. And I use this notion as a point of resistance where even if it's just one point, we can still move. And these are conclusions from a conversation with about the relationship between the body and landscape with Dr. Kirsten Buick. And I want to introduce a very, very important notion of the body that is very, very different from how it has been weaponized. Difference as infinitude. The notion of the body didn't exist prior to the so-called conquest. In the Americas, beings and things share the same spirit that fills them up with life. And remember, life is always at the core of ethics. And at the core of the encounters, we always find ethics. The difference is expressed and defined by the limits of difference. In this sense, in quotes, body needs to be understood as some sort of clothing or garment. And the garment or clothes also as a body. Eduardo Viveros Castro notes, it is not possible to distinguish between physiological processes and sociological processes. The transformation of the body, social relations, and the statutes that condense them are one and the same. Thus, human nature is literally manufactured or configured by culture. The body is imagined in every possible sense of the world by society. And what we see here is a Kayapo Macau boy. It goes hand in hand. Referenced by Diana Magaloni Kerpel in her lecture La Conquista en el Códice Florentino. And what she's explaining with this image is what we see here is a Macau boy, both at the same time. We're going to connect it to the notion of the divine. And what happens here is that we need to understand that our divinity is not limited by the body, but rather expressed through movement. However, we have learned to reject it by severing the connection with other species, with other beings, with our peers. So in this sense, it's embodiment rather than body. It's fluid. The body in the Americas didn't exist, doesn't exist. We need to understand it as a process of embodiment that allows movement. So I'm going to introduce two terms that are very important. And if I extend more than the time that was allocated, please let me know and we can figure. Okay. So friction, also known as non-dominant epistemologies, as we were mentioning with Audre Lorde. And I want to introduce two important terms, Ixiptla, and Alfredo Lopez Austin is a very important thinker who recently passed away. And he studies language to understand what language couldn't do, because it was one of the strategies that colonizers used in the process of extermination, the impossibility of naming. And we are going to challenge the notion of image. We're going to challenge the notion of body with these two terms. So Ixiptla, according to Lopez Austin, he explained, it's the protective deity as the notion of man-God, which I referred to the notion of infinitude, eternity, that also Levinas talks about. I don't even know if he actually read Levinas or not, but it's very similar. And it's also why I describe the picture of the macaw boy together. It's not a boy, it's not a macaw, it's both at the same time. So the notion of man-God, which is Ixiptla, he points out that this word has been translated as image, delegate, replacement, substitute, character, or representative, which is very limited. It doesn't really convey this notion of infinitude. But as he analyzes its root, sheep, and its relation to other words, he asserts it corresponds to the idea of skin, covering, or husk, suggesting that the man-God, apart from being the covering, the protection, it is the likeness of the God, the divine. And this is rooted in the notion also of text. This is also why we call what we wear textiles. Textiles are text in movement. So think about the notion of the skin, the covering, the husk, but at the same time, the manifestation of the divine is not fully. This is why our eyes are limited in the senses. They're very limited, but at the same time, it's how we manifest divinity. The possibility of rejecting empire relies on that divinity, the possibility of moving. Now, Toltecayotl, which is, according to some scholars, the closest to the definition of art, which I personally reject. I don't think it has anything to do with art. As we see, art is a problem. So, but it is defined as a dialogue between head and heart. And if you think about it, it has nothing to do with art. Toltecayotl is a group of complex ideas explaining the existence of the universe, life, and consciousness. Like I said, it has little to do with the definition of art, but rather should be understood as relish the fight. This is what Kirsten mentions frequently. It's a gift from her mother, and then she passed it to us, and we pass it also to our residents. This is how we need to understand these notions of the dialogue between the mind and the heart. It is how we relish the fight, which has become Archetopia's method, meaning the rhythm between the joy of making, the joy of writing, the joy of researching, of drawing, of painting, anything that takes us away from this world, while at the same time thinking about anger, because we can't just stay with anger. It will consume us, and we're going to see how anger is a response to the distortion of space into place. Audre Lorde distinguishes it, and I'll address it in a moment, between hate and anger. She mentions anger is a distortion, is a product of grief because of the distortion among peers. So they can be separate. We can't only say, oh, I'm just in Sparks, I want to be out of this world. We get so many residents that want to be racist by justifying the joy of making. And it's not the notion of becoming an activist is the only way we can survive. The joy of making without anger is useless. Anger without the joy of making is useless as well. So it's a way of moving. So movement rather than body. According to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the body is a historical idea rather than a natural species. It is an active process of embodying certain cultural and historical possibilities and a specific kind of making present. Because of practices that socially classifies bodies through space and time, ideologies such as race, class, gender, age, etc. are spatialized, learned, legitimated, and perceived as natural, necessary, and inevitable. Thus, our bodies are constantly weaponized, used to make the measurement of such spatial relations possible, forcing us to embody in specific ways. In other words, what I just said before, as Simone de Beauvoir asserted, the body is a manner of doing, dramatizing, and reproducing historical situations. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. However, we are much more than our bodies, or as RuPaul states or says, we're born naked and the rest is drag. We could even use drag better than body. Language into action. We are not only a casualty, we are also warriors, and we need to remember this. For every attempt to speak those truths for which we are still seeking, we encounter each other and we are obligated to listen. The transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger. This is also why we need to acknowledge the challenge of the body, the notion of being alone, the notion of being in danger. Because of the 19th century, we imagined feelings are facts. Feelings are never facts. I feel attacked. How could we not feel attacked if the world has been under attack since the 15th, 16th century? So feelings do indicate that something is changing. Some conditions are being transformed, and that's frequently the distortion of space into place. So we have to pay attention and learn to listen to each other. So this is why and how we transform silence into action. And it's an act of self-revelation. It's not that we need to learn who is the other in front of me. It's an act of self-revelation. Each of us is here now because in one way or another, we share a commitment to language and to the power of language and to the reclaiming of that language, which has been made to work against us. Levinas says, language, words are always born dead, have no future. This is why poetry presents a different possibility. In the transformation of silence into language and action, and think about how action is included, it is vitally necessary for each one of us to establish or examine her function in that transformation and to recognize her role as vital within that transformation. So it's also acknowledging how we are being present with each other. So the transformation of silence, the fact that we are here, I already read this one. No, the fact that we are here and that I speak these words is an attempt to break that silence and bridge some of those differences between us. For it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And think about how now she's putting into, she's identifying how it's not fear, but hate. And there are so many silences to be broken. We apply familiar paradigms onto new experiences in a manner that obscure what was distinctive about them and that demanded original thinking and a new paradigm, maintaining a kind of relationship to the past that constrained their ability to respond more effectively to the exigencies of the present. And this is from Hannah Arendt. To undo the burden that we place on identity object, meaning identity, to be representative of identity, we must instead understand objects as opportunities and as communicating events. And what Kirsten Buick is saying here is that every action is a communicating event. with the possibility of movement. And movement requires improvisation. It means the possibility of our work being released. And once it has been released, it should be able to produce improvisation with the viewer, with the reader. Not that we improvise the work as we make it, but actually as we read the work, it provokes improvisation like Audre Lorde is doing. So poetry as illumination. While we scrutinize the often painful face of each other's anger, please remember that it is not our anger which makes me caution you to lock your doors at night and not to wander the streets of whatever city we live in. It is the hatred which lurks in those streets, that urge to destroy us, all, if we truly work for change rather than merely indulge in academic rhetoric. And this is why we urge each other to actually work on change. These hatred and our anger are very different. Hatred is the fury of those who do not share our goals, and its object is death and destruction. And what Hannah Arendt explains is hatred and evil escapes our comprehension because we are brought into this world to create. And the moment we try to grasp it, we can't really understand it because it has no purpose. Hate destroys everything, even the evildoer. You can't control hate. However, anger is a grief of distortion between peers and its object is change. And this is how she begins to put that process into practice. I still have one, two, three more slides. Do we still have time to continue?
The class ends at 3:15, so some of the students might leave.
Okay.
If you can stay, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely.
Obviously, if you have to go to class, then please do that. And maybe what we can do is continue this, Francisco, if it's okay, so that we have the recording of it, and that we'll plan for you to maybe come back again in the class, and students, if they have questions about what you've presented, and maybe about your artwork, we'll find a moment in the class to bring you back with us to continue this amazing teaching. What do you think of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I know I didn't leave much time to questions, so I'll be happy to have another sessions and answer as many questions as they have and share other thoughts in relation to the question.
So let's finish, if for those who can stay, let's finish
Mhm.
your wonderful and informative lecture, and then we'll plan another session to continue.
Perfect. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has a direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. It is within this light that we form those ideas by which we pursue our magic and make it realize, which is what I call joy, the joy of making. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are until the poem nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt. And this is something to understand, that a lot of these experiences that we put in motion had already happened and in the process of making, because art is the problem, but not making art is also the problem. So we can only find the solution by making. And that's why I call it the joy of making. So between anger and the joy of making, one writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweat, or bitter it can possibly give. This is the only real concern of the artist, to recreate out of the disorder of life that order which is art. And it's not to romanticize art, is to actually allow it to become that space in which we appear. And this is the most important lesson: rhythm rather than body. Is a movement marked by the regulated succession of strong and weak elements, or of opposite or different condition? Ishitla. This is the divine. Rhythm is what connects anger with the joy of making. Toltecayotl. The dialogue between the mind and the heart. We can refuse infernal alternatives and stay with the trouble. As one slogan puts it, we are the offsprings of the witches they did not burn. And this is from Donna Haraway, which I love and admire. The battle. Lorde reminds her readers that the power to reclaim these forces uh, within is ours for the taking. The battle against US imperialism is the battle against white supremacy, because it's not really that we point fingers at the United States, but rather the ideology that took over the world, which always celebrates white supremacy. Is the battle against capitalism, is the battle against homophobia, is the battle against cancer. And this is something we need to think about. These experiences are not disconnected. And we'll talk about sugar later. So she wrote, in quotes, sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the manner of a revolution. But more usually, we must do battle where we are standing. The real blessing is to be able to use whoever I am, wherever I am, in concert with as many others as possible. Once more, her words beckons us to remember that interdependency, solidarity, and connection are the only means towards true belonging and survival. Now, as she wrote, is a time for real works urgencies. And I want to finish this presentation with this very, very important phrase from Kirsten. Difference is the difference that difference makes. It's not the body, it's not identity, it's movement in concert together with friction. It's never pleasant. It's never pleasant. Sometimes love, in the sense of how we care for each other, shakes you. You shake others. It's not the romantic love of the 19th century. It's difference is the difference that difference makes. And love in that sense is always obligation towards our neighbors. Thank you.
Wow, so much amazing insight. For those who are still here, students, I wonder if you have any questions. I know we've run over a little bit, but and if you don't feel comfortable saying, you could type in the chat box if that's easier.
And I know we covered a lot. I share some of the lessons that we have, and while students think of a question, because sometimes it's intimidating to ask a question. More than anything, what we need to think about is Audre Lorde's practice is time-based. So it's these are texts that we have to constantly go back to read about. They're not about feminism. They're not about racism. They're about how to figure out to survive together in this hateful world. And that implies this process of moving, of challenging. Frequently, most of our artists arrive with trauma. Trauma is never genetic, it's never inherited. It's not that we can heal in that sense and be again who we used to be. It's that we have to embrace change, but it's also not that we accept trauma as a violence that Christianity thinks it's transformative and will make us go through the tunnel to become better. It never makes us better, but we have to accept change in a larger sense. And something that Nayeli frequently mentions, we have to turn around and see each other. We might not be able to see each other through the body because it's always a problem, but to be able to stay with each other and move with asymmetrical rhythms to be able to listen to each other more than anything.
Wow, so powerful and beautiful. Thank you so much, Francisco. So much to absorb. I'm sure there are many of us processing and thinking through this really deep and rich teaching that sort of helps us deepen. But for me, as a student, as your student, deepening my understanding of Lord in new ways, helping me to think again with Lord's writing, and in ways I haven't thought before. So I'm sure that's happening for the students who are here. If there are any questions, please ask them.
Questions can come in any form, so feel free to ask a question about a term or an idea or an experience that you've had. Frequently, I make the distinction between intuition and intention. Our intuition always has questions, so Kristen calls them also teaching moments. So anyone who has any question to ask, feel free with no. It's always wonderful.
Oh, there's a hand.
Mhm.
A.
So I was just curious how you came to find Lord and her works and how, or rather, what did it look like, the process of creating Architopia around Lord?
Yes, absolutely. I first read Audre Lorde in Kirsten's class. However, the experience of reading her in Mexico was very different because how power is spatialized in a different context is very different. So it really crafted the possibility of allowing other voices to inform what Architopia should be and could be. So from the beginning, we keep in mind the question of justice. And although justice might seem unattainable, is really the responsibility we have with our neighbors. And what we have learned in the process is that, for instance, at Architopia, mainly women are the ones who have the power to decide. And in that sense, even with myself and Chris, we don't necessarily align with any notion of masculinity, men in that sense. And we had to learn and unlearn all these vicious ways in which we don't listen to each other. So our organization, for this reason, frequently finds spaces for women because the rhythm in which we move is faster than frequently other spaces. And that allowed the residency to become this kind of space for dialogue. We don't necessarily care about the structure of the class or I mean, of course we do, but rather than that, we focus on the process of dialogue. So reading Audre Lorde is a gift always because it even made me realize her experience in context of the knowledge that survived many centuries of extermination. And in the end, that's what makes artists apply to our programs, the survival of extermination. We have to go through so many vicious ways. And, this world is not getting better, it's getting worse. So it's to understand that even if the world is doomed, we are not, because present, past, and future coexist. And the only way to make sense of that, it's movement. So Audre Lorde teaches us how to move differently depending on the context, depending on the ways, it's I always and we think about asymmetrical rhythms to create a symphony that doesn't respond to empire. So in many ways, I have to trust ways of knowing and thinking that I don't know, that I don't understand, that I'm not necessarily seeing, but I know everyone surrounding me is never going to put me in danger. So in that sense, we learn to move together in different rhythms. I don't know if that responds to the question or if you have follow-ups.
No, it's interesting just because in one of her works, Lord talks about how when she was growing up, she would think in poems. And whenever someone would ask her, "How are you feeling?" she would try to pick a poem that embodied her feeling. Um, what I find is that when I read, it's more like a conversation or a story. And sometimes so I have to read a lot of research papers for my degree, and that is a very boring story to me. I have to pick out the parts that are interesting and that give life to the subject of the research. Um, so I always want to know how other people interact with Lord, because Lord is like a very condensed, familiar, but also very painful story that I'm trying to get through. But it's also a very moving story that I really want to interact with.
Yes, what I find really important in her teaching is that um, she's very generous in that space. And I mentioned to Eva in our first in the call that we had previous to this session about intuition. And like you mentioned, in many of these boring research papers, sometimes you can get a glimpse of the intuition of who's writing it, which is an experience of survival, which is not about the feeling, but rather the lesson of surviving with different rhythm. And that's the teaching I got from Lord, and that's the teaching I extend to our residents, because in many ways, we have learned to hate and accept hate as the norm, but rather resist it through different ways of moving. So we learn to make our, ways of explaining very academic, very intellectual, whatever, but rather our voices get subsumed in that process. So we have to figure out how to find the lesson of intuition, because intuition doesn't escape, it doesn't go away, doesn't remain in the work that we do, but it just gives us pattern of that intuitive way of learning that help us and others to survive. So I agree, it's always a dialogue in that sense.
If there are no more questions, then maybe we'll end here. See if there's any last question. Okay, then what we'll plan is we'll talk about it, Francisco, in terms of having you come back to class and maybe talk about your art as well, and opportunity for students to look at your slides, process, and then have questions for you. And hopefully, students, you'll find Francisco's email. So if you have specific questions, please email him as he offered. But thank you so much, so much for teaching us and inviting us to a kind of deeper conversation with Lord's teachings, especially as they connect to Mexico. Lots of things I didn't know and learned from you today. So
Wonderful.
thank you so much, so much. So good to see you all, Nayeli, and you as well. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. I always, it's an honor, it's a pleasure in every single way. Anytime you need us, we're here, and we'll continue in the next session. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Bye.